He took the first bite slowly, without rushing, without looking around, and as he lowered his hand, the room didn't react immediately, but something had already shifted, something small, almost invisible, that began to change the way everyone else moved. And it didn't happen all at once. The prisoners stood in front of the tables, each man positioned close to a tray, holding still while the food remained untouched in front of them. One prisoner near the center stepped forward and placed his hand on the edge of the table, holding it there as he looked down at the tray. Another man shifted his stance slightly, moving closer to his position without reaching forward, then stopped again. A third prisoner leaned forward just enough to examine the food, then straightened without making contact. One man adjusted his feet, stepping half a step forward, then holding his position as the room remained quiet. Another prisoner moved his hand toward the tray, stopping just before touching it, then lowering it again. A man near the front turned his head briefly toward the others, then faced forward again without moving further. One prisoner shifted his weight from one side to the other, maintaining his position while keeping his eyes fixed on the tray. Another man leaned closer, lowering his head slightly, then straightened again without acting. A third prisoner placed his hand on the table, sliding it forward slightly, then stopping as he hesitated. One man near the center finally moved, extending his hand toward the food and making contact for the first time. He lifted a piece slowly, holding it in front of him without raising it immediately, then paused again. Another prisoner beside him leaned forward, adjusting his position to watch more closely, then stopped. The man holding the food raised it toward his mouth, hesitated for a brief moment, then took a small bite. He lowered his hand halfway, chewing slowly while maintaining his posture. No one else moved. The room remained still, but the moment had already begun to shift as the action completed without interruption. He swallowed, then raised the food again and took a second bite, this time without hesitation. A prisoner nearby stepped forward slightly, closing the distance to his own tray, then stopped again. Another man adjusted his position closer to the table, lowering his head toward the food without touching it yet. The movement remained minimal, but the first action had already been repeated once. And as the second bite was taken without consequence and no response came from the guards, the first shift took place, because the action that had been avoided was now visible, and the stillness began to weaken. As the second bite was taken without interruption, several prisoners shifted their position at the same moment, not stepping forward completely, but adjusting their stance closer to the tables. One prisoner near the center placed his hand on the edge of the tray, holding it there briefly before sliding it slightly toward himself. Another man leaned forward and picked up a utensil, lifting it halfway, then lowering it again as he hesitated. A third prisoner stepped closer by one full step, reducing the distance between himself and the food, then stopped again. One man at the front extended his hand and touched the bread, holding it in place without lifting it, then pulled his hand back slightly. Another prisoner shifted to the side to get a clearer view, angling his body toward the man who had already taken a bite, then became still again. A man near the back leaned forward and placed both hands on the table, holding that position while looking down. One prisoner adjusted his footing, stepping forward with one foot, then bringing the other closer, stopping just in front of the tray. Another man reached forward and lifted a small piece of food, holding it in his hand without raising it to his mouth. A third prisoner moved his tray slightly closer, pulling it toward him by a few inches, then paused. One man at the center leaned forward further, lowering his head, then lifted it again without taking anything. Another prisoner raised a utensil once more, this time holding it longer before placing it back down again. A man near the front finally acted, lifting a piece of bread and bringing it halfway toward his mouth, then stopping before taking a bite. One prisoner beside him leaned forward quickly, picking up food, then holding it close to his tray without eating. Another man shifted his weight and stepped closer, closing the remaining gap, then stopped again. The movement across the room began to increase, but each action still paused just before completion. One prisoner at the center raised his hand again and this time took a small bite, lowering his hand immediately after. Another man followed, lifting his food and taking a quick bite without pausing, then stepping back slightly. A third prisoner leaned forward and took a bite while remaining in place, then straightened again. The actions began to repeat, not in unison, but in sequence, spreading from one side of the room to the other. And as more prisoners completed the action instead of stopping just before it, the second shift took place, because hesitation no longer held every movement, and the first reaction had begun to spread. As more prisoners completed the action without interruption, the pace inside the room began to increase, with fewer pauses between movements and more direct steps toward the tables. One prisoner near the front leaned forward and took a bite immediately after picking up his food, then continued without looking around. Another man pulled his tray closer with one hand, then reached forward and took a portion without slowing his movement. A third prisoner stepped forward quickly, closing the distance in one motion, then picked up food and ate without hesitation. One man at the center adjusted his position along the table, sliding slightly to the side, then leaned forward and continued eating in repeated motions. Another prisoner lifted a cup for the first time, bringing it to his mouth and drinking briefly before placing it back down. A man near the back moved around another prisoner, stepping into an open space, then reached forward and began eating without pausing. One prisoner leaned further over the table than before, taking consecutive bites without lifting his head between movements. Another man shifted his grip on a utensil and used it continuously without setting it down again. A third prisoner finished what he was holding and immediately reached for more, continuing the sequence without delay. One man stood briefly to reposition himself, stepping to the side, then sat down again and resumed eating without slowing. Another prisoner moved his tray into a more central position, aligning it directly in front of him before continuing with faster movements. A man at the center leaned forward, took a bite, then followed with another without pausing between actions. One prisoner stepped closer to the table and began eating while standing, not waiting to sit down. Another man adjusted his position quickly, then leaned forward and continued eating without interruption. A third prisoner reached across his tray to take food from another section, then continued in the same motion. The room filled with continuous movement, with each prisoner repeating actions without stopping to observe others. One man near the front finished his portion and immediately reached for another without lifting his gaze. Another prisoner leaned forward quickly, took a bite, then continued with the same rhythm without slowing. A third man who had hesitated earlier now stepped forward and began eating immediately, without any visible pause. The pattern became consistent across the room, with actions repeating faster and more directly than before. And as the movement accelerated and hesitation disappeared almost entirely, the third shift took place, because the action had become automatic, and the moment that began with one bite was now driving the entire room. As the movement across the tables became steady and continuous, several prisoners began to slow their actions slightly, not stopping, but adjusting the rhythm as they became aware of what was happening around them. One prisoner near the center lowered his hand after taking a bite, paused for a brief moment, then looked down at the tray before continuing more slowly. Another man leaned back slightly from the table, lifting his shoulders away, then leaned forward again and resumed eating with a reduced pace. A third prisoner turned his head while chewing, looking toward the others for a moment, then faced forward again and continued. One man at the front took a bite, then held the food in his hand without immediately taking another, watching the movement around him before continuing. Another prisoner shifted his position along the bench, moving a few inches to the side, then resumed eating in a more controlled rhythm. A man near the back lifted his cup, drank slowly, then placed it down carefully before continuing. One prisoner leaned forward, took a bite, then stopped briefly with his hand resting on the table before moving again. Another man adjusted his tray, sliding it slightly away from him, then pulled it back and continued eating. A third prisoner turned his head again toward the guards, holding the look for a moment while chewing, then returned his gaze to the table. One man stood up slightly from his seat, repositioned himself, then sat back down and resumed eating at a slower pace. Another prisoner reached forward and took food, then paused before bringing it to his mouth, delaying the action for a moment. A man at the center leaned forward, took a bite, then stopped again briefly, holding his position as if recalibrating his movement. One prisoner lowered his hands completely for a second, then picked up his food again and continued. Another man shifted his feet under the table, adjusting his position before leaning forward again. A third prisoner took a smaller bite than before, then slowed his next movement as he continued. The pace across the room no longer increased, but stabilized into a controlled rhythm, with each man adjusting his actions based on what he had just experienced. And as the rapid movement settled into something more deliberate and measured, the fourth shift took place. Because the action had not only spread, it had begun to change in nature, becoming more controlled and aware. As the pace across the room stabilized, several prisoners began to change the way they moved, not by stopping, but by making their actions more deliberate and controlled. One prisoner near the front lowered his hand after finishing a bite, paused, then reached forward again with a slower and more precise movement. Another man leaned back slightly, lifting his shoulders away from the table, then leaned forward again and resumed eating with a measured rhythm. A third prisoner turned his head toward the others while holding food in his hand, then returned his gaze to the tray and continued without hesitation. One man at the center adjusted his position on the bench, sliding slightly to align himself more directly with the table before continuing to eat. Another prisoner lifted his cup, took a longer drink than before, then placed it down carefully and resumed eating at a slower pace. A man near the back stood up briefly, stepping to the side to create space, then sat down again and continued eating without urgency. One prisoner reached forward and took a smaller portion than before, bringing it to his mouth more slowly, then paused before the next movement. Another man adjusted his tray again, pulling it closer, then aligning it directly in front of him before continuing. A third prisoner leaned forward, took a bite, then lowered his hand and paused with both hands resting on the table. One man turned his head toward the guards again, holding the look for a moment while chewing, then returned his gaze to the tray. Another prisoner slowed his movements further, taking a bite and then waiting before reaching for more. A man at the center lifted his hand, held the food briefly, then lowered it without taking a bite before trying again. One prisoner shifted his feet under the table, adjusting his posture before leaning forward again. Another man took a final bite from what he was holding, then reached forward for another portion with a controlled motion. A third prisoner finished a portion completely, then stopped briefly before continuing, maintaining the same steady rhythm. The room no longer showed hesitation or rapid movement, but a consistent pattern of controlled actions, repeated without urgency. And as each prisoner adjusted his pace to match this new rhythm, the fifth shift took place, because the action that had begun as hesitation and turned into speed had now settled into deliberate control that no longer needed to be questioned. As the controlled rhythm continued across the room, the pace began to slow gradually, not because of hesitation, but because each tray was reaching its end and each action was becoming more spaced out. One prisoner near the front lowered his hand after finishing what he was holding, paused briefly, then reached forward to collect what remained on his tray. Another man leaned back slightly in his seat, lifting his shoulders away from the table, then leaned forward again and took a final bite before stopping. A third prisoner wiped his hands against his clothing, then adjusted his position on the bench and sat more upright without moving further. One man lifted his cup, drank slowly, then placed it down carefully and rested both hands on the table in front of him. Another prisoner gathered the remaining items on his tray closer together, sliding them toward the center before stopping his movement. A man near the center stood up after finishing, pushing himself away from the table, then stepping back to create space for others. One prisoner beside him followed, rising from his seat and adjusting his stance before standing still near the table. Another man remained seated but no longer eating, lowering his hands and keeping his gaze directed toward the empty tray in front of him. A third prisoner shifted his feet under the table, then adjusted his position again before becoming still. One man near the back stepped away from the table, taking a few slow steps toward the open space before stopping and turning slightly. Another prisoner lifted his tray, repositioned it, then set it down again and remained standing without further movement. A man at the edge of the room leaned back slightly, then straightened and remained still as the activity around him decreased. One prisoner turned his head toward the guards once more, holding the look briefly before returning his gaze forward. Another man adjusted his position slightly, stepping closer to others before stopping again as the space around them settled. The room transitioned from continuous movement into a quieter state, with small adjustments replacing the earlier rhythm of repeated actions. And as more prisoners finished and either stood or remained seated without moving, the final shift took place, because the moment that had begun with hesitation and accelerated into action had now settled into a stable pattern that no longer required observation before movement. They had expected the food to confirm what they already believed about captivity: small portions, strict control, and limited access. But as the trays were placed in front of them and nothing prevented them from reaching forward, the hesitation that held them back at the beginning began to break, not because they were told to move, but because one action was completed without consequence and repeated again. As the first bite turned into a second, and the second turned into a sequence of movements that spread across the room, the stillness disappeared and was replaced by a pattern of action that no longer required observation before continuation, allowing each prisoner to move without waiting for someone else to act first. And as the meal came to an end and the room settled into a slower and more controlled rhythm, the change remained visible through their movement alone, because what they had expected to be restricted was not, and the absence of limitation had already reshaped the way they responded to the moment in front of them. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.